Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 137. Today's guest is Gabrielle Bates. Hello, everyone. Happy New Year, and welcome to the show. I am thrilled to be starting off 2023 and the 7th year of Keep the Channel Open with a conversation with poet Gabrielle Bates. Gabrielle Bates is the author of Judas Goat, which is out now from Tin House and was named by Vulture and the Chicago Review of Books as a must-read book of 2023. A Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Fellowship finalist, Bates's poems have appeared in The New Yorker, the Academy of American Poets Poem-a-Day, Plowshares, American Poetry Review, and elsewhere. Originally from Birmingham, Alabama, she currently lives in Seattle, where she helps out at Open Books, a poem emporium, and co-hosts the podcast The Poet Salon. You can find her at her website, on Twitter at Gabrielle Bates, and Instagram at Gabrielle_Bates_. Now, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you may remember that Gabby joined me in March 2021 for a KTCO book club episode discussing Bridget Begin Kelly's book Song. You may also have heard me say before what a huge fan I am of the Poet Salon. Well, on top of all of that, I've been reading Gabby's poems online and in journals for several years now, and it is not an exaggeration to say that they have been some of the most unforgettable poems I've read in that time. So, as you might imagine, I was really looking forward to her debut collection, Judas Goat, and I was thrilled to have her back on the show to talk about the book. Before we get started, a couple of notes. There are links in the show notes to purchase copies of Judas Goat from Open Books in Seattle, from the Book Catapult here in San Diego, and from bookshop.org. Though, as always, I highly recommend buying from your own local independent bookstore. Also, the book tour for Judas Goat just started, and here are just a few of Gabby's upcoming events. This coming Friday, January 27th, Gabby will be doing a reading at Powell's in Portland, Oregon with Luther Hughes. On February 24th, the East Coast launch of Judas Goat will be happening at Brooklyn Poets in Brooklyn, New York. And on March 23rd will be the Southern launch at Thank You Books in Birmingham, Alabama. You can find a full list of events on Gabby's website at gabriellebat.es, and there is a link in the show notes for that. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Gabrielle Bates.
I mean, this is my first book, so all of these feelings are very new to me. And it turns out there's a real difference emotionally between celebrating other people's books coming into the world, and celebrating your own. It's not as fun celebrating your own. There's a lot of messier feelings that go along with it. And I'm actually holding my very first finished copy of the book right now. And it just feels really weird and beautiful and terrifying and bizarre. And so this is my first podcast interview about the book. And I feel a little nervous about that as well. But I'm really glad it gets to be with someone I really like and admire, and on a show that I listen to.
Well, thank you so much. Well, so, for what it's worth, I really loved your book. I've been looking forward to it for quite some time. Obviously, I've been reading your poems as they've been individually published for a couple of years now. And I've always, every single one that I've ever read has been one that moved me, one that I found a lot of, profundity, a lot of, ability to come back to it and keep engaging with it. And so I was really looking forward to this collection as a whole. And it really was everything that I kind of hoped that it would be. So
Thank you. Oh my gosh. You have no idea what that means to me to hear you say that.
Well, I'm just glad that I got the opportunity to read it, and I've read it 3 times now, and it's been great. I've been noticing little things new in each reread. I was wondering if we could start with a reading.
Yeah, of course. I think we'll just start at the beginning.
Okay.
With the first poem. The dog. He didn't want to tell me. He almost didn't. It was luck, much more than gut, that made me ask. A beer opened an hour earlier than usual. the desire for conversation. There was no sense in me that he was in some sort of aftermath. He said, when I asked, I had a bad day, or I had a weird day, I can't remember. I saw a dog, he said. I was on the train. A man with a dog on a leash. The man ran and made it, but the dog hesitated outside and the doors closed. No, not on his neck. On the leash, trapping it. The man was inside and the dog was outside on the platform. The button beside the door ringed in light, blinked. The man was shouting now, hitting the button, all else silent. The befuddlement of a dog pulled along, the pace slow until it wasn't. The tunnel the train must pass through, leaving the station, is a perfectly calibrated, unforgiving fit. The dog had a color and a size I don't know, so it comes to me as legion. Large, small, fur long or short, white or gray. But the man always looks the same. As I held him against me in our kitchen, the moment sharpened my eyes. How easily I could imagine a version of our lives in which he kept all his suffering secret from me. I saw the beer on the counter. I saw myself drink it. When we went to bed, I stared at the back of his head, split between compassion and fury. My nails gently scratching up his arm, up and down, up and down, the blade without which the guillotine is nothing.
Thank you. So, this is one of these poems, I remember reading it when it was first published a while back, and it's one that has really stuck with me over the years, and I loved seeing this open the collection. And I know you talked with another interview, I can't remember which, about this poem being the one that opens it, how you'd wanted to include it. You knew you wanted to include it, but it didn't necessarily fit elsewhere. So you kind of have it sort of offset a little bit. So it's before the epigraph and sort of offset from the rest of the collection, which I find kind of interesting because to me, this poem, it does a lot of things. I think it's a good introduction to the collection because I feel like a lot of the things that I associate with your poetry are things that are present in this poem. Particularly, there is this sort of juxtaposition of tenderness and something other than tenderness, something more like whether it might be violence or something darker. There is this quality to the verse that one way that I've described this when I've talked to other people is that I feel like many of your poems are loud in their quietness, that they have a stillness to them that is not a quietness that is comforting or peaceful. It's a quiet that has a certain menace to it.
Mm-hmm. Disquieting.
Yes, yes. And also the way that different moments are layered on top of each other so that they kind of almost feel like they're happening at the same time. So I'm not sure exactly which of those things I want to start off with, which aspects of those. But, well, one, I love this poem, and I have loved it for a long time. I guess what I want to talk about is that sense of quietness, that sense of stillness. And is it something that you're doing on purpose? Is it something that you're shooting for? Or, because I feel like it runs so strongly through so many of your poems, that sort of disquieting feeling that it must be something that you're reaching for, but also I'm not exactly sure how to articulate what I mean, but do you sort of maybe get where I'm going?
I appreciate you unpacking that poem and tying it to other poems and a general aesthetic. It means so much to me, and it rings true in an aspirational sense. And I think that disquieting mood and that sort of crackling whisper vibe is innate to my style, maybe more than something I'm ever striving for on purpose. I mean, voice is so hard to talk about. It's kind of an infamous craft element, if we can even call it a craft element. What is the voice? But I do think that the poems I write that end up feeling like they have some sort of life to them come to me in that sort of whisper. It's like a menacing whisper. And I wonder if that's part of why it's really difficult for me to read them out loud to other people. It's always makes me feel a little split in half or something, because that voice is so interior in my head, and it's impossible to replicate with my actual voice. And so there's a bizarre estrangement that happens when I read them out loud to other people. It can be difficult to switch back and forth between reading a poem and having a conversation like this, or in public readings, doing the sort of banter in between, because it feels like switching such big railroad tracks,
Yeah, well, especially because, banter between readings, is so often lighter. It's such a different, it's a different mode.
Yeah. It's like scuba divers getting the bends when they try to come back up from the depths too quickly. It's like, okay, I'm going to read this really intense interior poem and then rocket back up to the surface for a second and then plummet all the way back down. There's something unnatural about that.
Yeah. I'm thinking again about this sort of layering of moments and how memory works in some of your poems. Another one that comes to mind is the one Person Comes from Mask. In this one, like in several of your poems, also in the bridge, the speaker of the poems is relating something that already happened, something in the past, or something in the present of the poem is reminding the speaker of something in the past. But when we move into that memory, it's not like that feels like it's in the past, right? It's something that is being enacted again through the poem. So whether that is the squirrel in Person Comes from Mask, or the hose that becomes a snake in the bridge, or whether it is this moment here where the memory, it doesn't feel like something past as you're reading it. It feels like something that's present. It feels very urgent. And also interesting too, that the moment of the truly awful part of this particular memory, the speaker kind of looks away from it. It's what happens, but you don't get the description of it. I feel like that there is something about poetry in particular that can do things with memory in this way. This isn't totally a question, but I want to see if this sort of sparks anything for you, which is just that one of the things that we know we've learned from like modern neuroscience, for example, is that when you remember something, you're not actually just playing back a recording. You're actually having the experience over again. You're creating a new experience in the act of remembering. And it feels like many of your poems are doing that too. And also poems that we've talked about, you and I have talked about together, like, for example, some of Bridget Begin Kelly's poems that we talked about when you were on the show before. So I guess I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, for you, how this engagement with memory works, what is it about it that feels so urgent and necessary to do in this way, and how you use this in your poetry.
You mentioned that the biggest, most disturbing image in the poem, The Dog, happens off screen. And I'm really fascinated generally in both the image in poetry and in the role of silence in poetry. And that poem is really an example of those two interests really meeting, because I also have a lot of questions about representations of violence in art of all kinds and how to do it and what it does and the power of omission and the imagination. So that's really just a word salad of a bunch of interests that I'm in that your question made me think about. But also I love this question about memory, and it's reminding me of just how fictional my poetry feels, even when, and maybe especially when, it's explicitly inspired by a lived autobiographical experience. And I think it might have something to do with the fact of remembering as rewriting, as creative, as creating act. There are very few poems in this book that really feel like nonfiction to me, even though there are a lot of moments and images and triggers that quote unquote really happened. It definitely feels fictional. It feels like characters speaking, characters interacting that I've created and set into motion in various ways. And yeah, I think that does have something to do with just how memory works and is encoded and the unreliability of it. And also, with this book that is often reaching back into childhood or my early 20s, I grew up with a rich, imaginative inner life as an introverted only child who read a lot. And I mistrust a lot of my memories from that standpoint too, just because I don't know. I think I made a lot of stuff up in my head and was telling stories to myself all the time. And yeah, it all feels like fiction.
It's such an interesting thing to hear you say. And a number of things occur to me. One, the first thing always when I think about stuff like this is sort of the distinction between the truth of a piece versus the fact of it. And I think that fiction can get at something truthful without necessarily being factual. Mm-hmm. This thing that you're talking about with omission is definitely something that runs through many of your poems. This sense of menace that I described when I first started talking about this poem, when I think about how violence is very present in many forms throughout this collection, throughout the poems in this collection. And yet it is very rarely actually depicted. And when it is depicted, it almost feels less real. Like the one in particular that I'm thinking of is when her second horn, the only horn she has left, that has a relatively violent image that it starts with. And yet that one feels less real somehow. It feels more like a fable or like symbolism than the violence, whether that might be the violence of being separated from a parental figure or the violence of, having a certain way of thought or life being imposed upon a young person, or whether the literal violence of sexual assault, which is, whether it's something that we get the picture has happened to the speaker of some of these poems, or that the speaker is just concerned about the possibility of happening at certain times. None of these things are ever really looked at directly. They're not described in scene, if that makes sense. And yet, in a way, that makes them feel more present than the things that are actually present. I don't know how that works,
I don't know how that works either. But I've intuited it, and I've followed that intuition. Yeah, and thinking about and writing into fears and how to conjure this sense of threat and haunting. I feel it a lot more when it's in the shadows and the silences, off screen, a possibility as opposed to a foreclosed, conclusion. Claire Schwartz on David Naiman's podcast, Between the Covers, talked a bit about the idea of the spectacle. And I found that so interesting. And, I think my book is very much engaged with the spectacle, but by a kind of omission primarily. And the spectacle in the sort of smallest, most domestic, most shadowy, intimate arenas.
Yeah. Another thing that you said when you were talking just a minute ago about mistrusting the stories, mistrusting your memory, thinking that the stories that you told as a child are things that you just sort of made up. And what that sort of brings to mind for me is that I know that this collection was a long time coming, that I think that in other interviews you've talked about how it took like 10 years to write this, or that it's a journey from initial conception to publication was about 10 years.
Yeah.
And
which is funny how relative that is, because, there was a time when I would say, 10 years, that's a lifetime. That's so long. And now I look at it and I think, yeah, like that's not that long, is it? Some people it takes 20 years, sometimes 30.
I mean, that's true, but I don't think that even the longest lived of us, there's none of us that where 10 years is not a significant portion of our lives.
Yeah, that's true.
But what I'm sort of brought to mind here is that in the course of 10 years, something that feels fresh when we first experience it and then fresh again when we first write it, that our relationship to it has time to change over 10 years. And I'm hearing you say that you mistrust some of your young memories, many of which appear to be, these poems are engaging very directly with. And I wonder whether your relationship with these poems has changed. I mean, I feel like they must have. So like how that relationship has changed in the intervening years.
I think one reason it's helpful for me to think of my poetry as fiction is that I'm less in danger of totally believing my own poems as how anything in my life happened, because it's so easy for me to see how they would just sort of replace or become the stand-in for a memory. And I think when you're slowly culling a collection together, you have time to really only gather the ones that still feel true to you in that sort of magical, way that fiction can feel true, that emotional truth carrying some sort of living resonance for you. So it's interesting how some of the oldest poems in the collection, I don't have that sense of feeling tired of them or like a totally different person wrote them or anything like that, because I think so many poems I've written did not make it into this book. I think there were a lot of those poems that I would have felt, cringy about, or like I'd totally outgrown them. But because I spent such a long time, cutting poems from this book and only keeping this selection, they all feel sort of in conversation with each other and like they're asking similar questions. And yeah.
I think that's true. They do feel very much in conversation. It also feels like the way they're arranged has an arc to it. For me, when I think of, again, getting back to this idea of the truth versus the fact of fiction, so much of how we as human beings, whether or not we're writers or even readers, but so much of how we as human beings understand the world and understand ourselves has to do with stories and has to do with, like, we all create stories for ourselves, whether or not we write them down. But I think that those of us who are explicitly writers, I mean, I have yet to discover someone who is a writer who writing for them, it doesn't interact at all with that sort of personal story making, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so taking that with the sort of the way that over any significant portion of our lives, like 10 years is going to be a significant portion of anybody's life, that having this ability to revisit these stories that you've written down and having, even without that time elapsing, the process of writing something and creating something artistic out of it can change one's relationship to what's being written or what motivated the writing. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think all of these poems, while they do still feel alive to me, I feel very distanced from them, and that it feels like a particular version of myself wrote all of these and was really invested in some of the things we've talked about with, this ever-present threat of violence. And a kind of vigilance in moving through the world and in looking at the world, always alert for the threat, whether that was coming from men in general or authority in general or anything like that. And it feels like a different version of me. Like I don't move through the world on or off the page with that sort of hyper alert vigilance anymore. I've been reflecting on that over the last year. And I wonder how much of it has to do with the fact that this book is done. It's an object. It's out of my hands. I can't change anything about it anymore. And I wonder if that process is allowing me to turn to a new chapter in my own way of moving through the world. I don't know yet.
It is interesting to think about how the process of writing and sitting with our writing can kind of affect some kind of change within ourselves. It always feels a little bit magical to me.
Yeah, me too. And, curiosity and attention. And once you feel a book coming together, it can really streamline your obsessions and interests in this way because you realize what you're fascinated by, and then you can go after it a little more directly. And I think there's a beautiful aspect to that. And there can be a danger to that too, if the things you're looking at are violence and terror of various kinds. I hope that moving forward, I can maybe attend to something that feels, I don't know, a little more joyful, a little softer. But I don't know, maybe my obsessions are my obsessions forever, and I'll always sort of be enchanted by the quiet horror stories.
That's something that I know, for example, that Danez Smith has talked about with, their early poems being a lot more sort of fiery or a lot more rooted in things that are traumatic. And when I talked with Luther Hughes recently, that was something that
yeah, I've heard of him.
But that was something that he also talked, when I talked with him about A Shiver in the Leaves, that, many of those poems are also rooted in trauma, and particularly in Black Death and Black trauma, and how for both Danez and Luther, writing those poems was important, but also that both of them have said, I haven't talked to Danez personally, but I listened to their podcast many times. But, focusing on something that feels more joyful is something that they've both talked about. Interestingly, you and I had a conversation on Twitter last summer, a little bit of a conversation that sort of touches on this. And you were talking about how I hope this is okay. I have this. I actually
bring it out. Quote it back.
I wrote it down.
Can't wait to hear what I said.
You said so. This was in July of 2021, actually. So more than a year ago now. And you said, "I wish I was capable of writing that encompasses the real complexity and tangle and range of my life experiences. For whatever reason, I am doomed so far to only have the language for the violent, the achy, the haunting, the severe. It feels so unfair to the beloveds in my life that again and again I can only write into nightmares and wounds, that basically every experience I render on the page is a dark, chilling experience. In my life, there is so much nuance, so much joy, so many other kinds of memory." And so it's interesting to hear you, like a year and a half later, hear you talk about how maybe you are starting to move on from that. Do you feel like, you kind of said this already, that it feels like there is a bit of a transition happening for you. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I do. And it's interesting hearing those words read back to me, just remembering I was in such a pit when I wrote that. I was really dealing with some serious self-loathing, and
I think a lot of us were having a hard time at that point.
Yeah, we were. I was not alone in that. And it's all a journey and a cycle. And yeah, I really appreciated being able to talk with other writers and artists about these sorts of feelings. And we just only have so much of a choice when it comes to the kind of art that we can make live. And I do believe there are opportunities to shift and attend to certain kinds of things and allow different kinds of art making into our life. And yeah, I don't feel as as overwhelming despair about the kind of poetry I write. And maybe that's just because I've had more time to get used to the fact of this book coming into the world. Maybe it just feels so inevitable at this point that I've had to kind of disconnect. Maybe I've done a better job of talking with certain family members as this book prepares to come into the world and making sure everyone feels really loved. And, I do feel in a different place, and I'm curious to see what my writing will look like moving forward, if it will feel to me and to others like a significant departure in that way. I hope so. I hope to reach for, more of the nuance, like I said, because there's a certain kind of truth that these poems are getting at, but there's so many other truths too, so many other facets to my life and to my relationships with other people.
It's just say I always go back to the women, it's, we all contain multitudes.
Yeah, it's true.
So another thing that, you mentioned paying attention to things. I find that in this poem, there's a little bit of a running thread through several of the poems about attention and focus. In Person Comes from Mask, there is a whole thing here, but it starts off with the lines, complete focus can resemble utter distraction. Just like there's a point where my lover begins to look like a stranger and large things begin to look small. Then at that point, this twitching squirrel becomes, a squirrel that's being eaten by wasps. And in Ownership, Bent Close, I described it until it was strange, then familiar, then stranger. And I almost feel like that this is a little bit of, I want to say an Ars Poetica, but not, I don't know if that's exactly what I mean, but I feel like there is this quality of looking at things until they become strange and then familiar and then strange again, running through many of your poems, and that this may actually in some ways describe at least part of your writing process. But I wanted to see how that sounds to you.
I think it absolutely does. Yeah, I think that is a window into the process and a kind of Ars Poetica, and my practice of writing poetry, and particularly in regards to the image and this idea that if we pay attention long enough or describe something long enough, that the surface will give way to some sort of deeper, stranger, truer something. I think that's definitely a major thing that draws me to writing poetry in particular, but also reading it. It's all the same process, isn't it? Really, I feel like ghosts of each other, shadows of each other. And I'm fascinated by the layers that I feel all around me, both in the objects I look at and the dynamics between human beings. I'm obsessed by trying to peel back those layers. I'm a kind of pathologically nosy person in various ways. And there's just so much about the world that I sense hiding behind the surfaces, and writing poetry feels like a way to imagine what it might be.
Yeah. In particular, I feel like many of these poems take that process of attention and tie it specifically to language. Like I'm thinking of the line in the bridge, which for me was one of the sort of standout lines of the whole collection. If I describe something, anything long enough, language will lead me back to wanting it. And to me, it's not just a matter of the attention of the poet here being focused in one way or another, but specifically language having some effect on the poet, language having some effect on the reader. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I remember writing that poem when I was really depressed, and I was thinking, what are the tools at my disposal to try to reckon with this or do something. And I really was trying to write myself back in love with the world in some way, to awaken myself to something other than my depression. That line was the hope that I could conjure from that state. I just decided I would, almost like writing myself a spell, like choosing to believe, at least for a moment, that language could have this power, and what might that feel like, to have agency with language that could affect something.
There is something, I think, and I've talked with other people on the show about this before, about poetry and language in particular having a sort of incantatory property to it. Right now I'm thinking of my conversation with Kazim Ali when we talked about not just the words and the language, but the sounds particularly of the words, and how different sounds in many different religious contexts, sound is actually doing something in the universe. Mm-hmm. And I think that in itself, it makes an interesting thing to talk about. Obviously, there's a certain music to, well, poetry in general, I think, tends to have music to it. That's part of what makes it poetry, your poems as well. But actually, another thing that I was thinking about was not necessarily what the poems sound like, but actually what they look like. Because I know that you're a visual artist as well. And so you are a visual artist. You also have done and do work that marries image and text, which is something that I always find fascinating when other people do, because that's something that I'm very interested in my own work. And here, the visual side of things, there aren't pictures in these poems as there are with some of your other work. But I still feel like the way that the poems look on the page is doing something in many of the poems. In particular, I'm thinking about poems like Little Lamb. The way that the stanzas are indented, it actually makes it look like you're having a text conversation with somebody, when you have their little bubbles on two sides of the screen, or Conversations with Mary, or ones like Ice and Tithes, where there's this verticality, or all like in Tithes, there's the verticality, but also huge amounts of white space. And I'm always so interested in that, because I think so much of the time there is this sort of, I don't know if this is kind of like a boring question when it comes to poetry, because like kind of in the way that like film versus digital and photography is just a really boring question, But to me, there's this thing that I think about a lot with poetry, and it's the difference between how the poetry lives on the page and how it lives in the mouth, that the sound of the poem, like if you're used to only reading poems and not hearing them or saying them, then there are things about the music of the language that you can miss, right? And so that is something that for me, usually as a reader of poetry, is something that I often have to like make myself read poems out loud to try and get at that part. But I feel like in many poems, there's an aspect that you also can't get if you just hear it. Like there are things about those poems, to me, that the way that they look on the page is such an integral part of how they work, that if you were to say them out loud and you didn't have the text in front of you, you'd be missing a big part of that. And I'm not sure exactly what the question is here, except that just as a person who also is trying to do things with the visual and the textual in my own work, I'm always really interested to talk to other people about how that works for them when it comes to approaching their work.
The visual is so important to me, and I approach it intuitively. Like all aspects of form, I'm trying to listen to what each individual poem seems to want. And I think, different poets, their poems live the most in different arenas, and mine definitely feels like poetry that's for the page, that's meant to be encountered with the eye. All those poems you mentioned, they expose, I think, some of the obsessions we've already talked about a bit in terms of layering of experience, multiple voices or figures in a kind of dialogue, and also a chasm, a split between something, a breach that can't be crossed or that has to be crossed, a leap that has to be made. And so the visual aspects of poetry, whether that's the length of the line or the number of lines in a stanza or some sort of back and forth arrangement, it feels incredibly integral to me, to the experience of the poem. It's a layer of meaning without which I feel like it's a totally different poem in some ways. And I've wondered with a poem like Ice Tides that has the two columns, which isn't a contrapuntal. It's not a poem that's intended to be, read down the columns and across, but I really was trying to imagine those bracketed sections on the side as happening sort of concurrently at the same time, as a kind of overlap, which of course with language on a page, with text on a page, things have to happen in a certain kind of linear order. But I was trying to imagine, visually, how could I signal that these things are actually sort of overlapping without actually overlapping the text and thereby making it sort of unreadable. I think those sorts of experiments are interesting as processes, as experiments in and of themselves, but as reading experiences, I find them very unfulfilling usually. So I wanted to play around with how could this be both legible and wink at a kind of overlapping experience in time.
I mean, it's interesting that you say working with text has to be a certain linear order. In my mind, the visual aspects of it are a lot less linear than spoken, right? Because the sounds have to come out in a certain order, even if they're overlapped. Whereas on the page, they already exist all at the same time. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. The poem on the page is like an object, a shape.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
I would love to hear more about the sorts of experiments you've been doing, if you're willing to share, when it comes to image and text. Are you layering text with your photos?
Well, for me, I'm not doing anything really out there with it yet. I may. Who knows what the future holds.
Who knows?
But a lot of times what I'm trying to do is, I think, something a little more akin to the sort of poetry comics that you do, where it's the image is doing something and the text is doing something. And, you don't want the image to be just an illustration of the text, and you don't want the text to just be a caption for the image. You want each of them to be doing something, but then together they're doing something more.
Yeah.
I find that really a fascinating process. And for me, I think that there is something interesting about photography being such a literal medium, and one that is so much about representation in its guts, that I'm always just sort of trying to think about what does the image do, and what can image do, and what can text do. And I often find that when I'm just writing with text, I get frustrated about the limitations of that sort of medium. When I'm just taking photographs, I get frustrated with that. So putting them together is sort of a way of, I don't know how successful I am at it, but trying to sort of use the intersection of them to overcome the limitations of any one of them. But I'm not actually sure that's possible.
Yeah, but doesn't it feel fun to try it out and see? I think, we learn so much from those sorts of experiments, and it sounds like we share a lot of the same questions in that regard, like what can language do that, visual imagery can't, and vice versa, and how can they play together? And, I've been obsessed with those sorts of questions for a long time. And right this second, I'm really interested in leaning into trying to figure out what all language imagery can do. I've sort of turned away from making visual art, though, as we've said, I'm still very attentive to the visual shape of language on a page. And that feels like an important aspect of my poems. But yeah, I'm really interested in how words can conjure an image in another person's mind, and how that other person's mind meets it and changes it. And yeah, I don't know. I totally think it's magical, and I think I'll probably be obsessed with those sorts of things my whole life.
It's, bringing this back to also this thing that you mentioned about the poems, how often that they are sort of concerned with or engaging with this sort of chasm between two things, I feel like that there is something very relevant to the sort of chasm between image and text. And, you know, I mean, I don't know why anybody else does what they do. For myself, my when I make stuff, I didn't always know this, but I've come to realize this about myself, that everything I make is me trying to reduce the distance between me and somebody else, even if I don't know who that person is. And what I find really interesting about so many of the poems in this collection is that distance between two people, like two characters that appear, two figures that appear in one poem or another, is very present. And there is this, what I feel in a lot of the poems is a desire to bridge that gap, right? But also a tentativeness to do so, you know, like in the poem that you read, in The Dog, the speaker of the poem and the man that she's talking about and interacting with. Also interesting that in a few parts of the poem that there is a discussion of the man with the dog, but then immediately after there's a he that can be, you could read it as like, who is the he, you know, referring to that. Sorry, that was just a little bit of a tangent, but
yeah, no, it's all related.
But where there's this disconnect between the speaker and her loved one, and there's a desire to create a connection or to tie it to sort of closen that connection, but also kind of a desire not to, you know, that I find really fascinating. And I think that also runs through many of the poems, whether it's the connection is between the speaker and like a father figure, or the speaker and one of many mother figures that runs through, whether a literal mother, a stepmother, or like a poetic mother. And there's something about that sort of push and pull, right? That's present in that interaction I find really interesting, and also like maybe more honest than just saying, well, of course we want to be connected to each other, you know, like so much of what I do, it's not that I'm being dishonest by saying I want to be connected to people, but rather that it makes the interaction very simple, right? Whereas I feel like it's usually not actually, like in any specific way, in any specific relationship. And all of our relationships that we actually have with other people in our lives are specific. That specificity can't be simple. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think you articulated, if I had to boil down a central, most primary tension in the book, I think it is something like what you just described, between this overwhelming longing and desire for closeness and this deep fear of closeness and a deep love of privacy. You have privacy and a kind of sacred secretness on the one hand, and then you have intimacy and connection on the other, and how to have both is, I think, something that vexes the characters who speak in this collection, and also, you know, that vexes me as just a human being moving through the world and having changing relationship to attachment in general. And yeah, I think that is a really honest part of the book for me personally. And those two pools, the push and the pull.
Well, I there's like a lot that we haven't gotten to, but I think we need to head into the break, and then we'll come back and do the second segment.
People can get the book and read it.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
My topic feels really general, but it is genuinely what's been on my mind the last couple of days. And it's just the sort of role that literature plays in my life and in the world, and the value or possible values of poetry, just sort of at large in general in my personal life and in the world. These are the sorts of things I've been thinking about, maybe because it's a new year and that feels like a time for reflection and big thoughts. I don't know. I feel like my thoughts are usually much smaller and more concrete, but I have to be honest, those are the sorts of things I've been thinking about.
Now, do you mean like more as a reader, an audience member of literature, or do you mean more as someone who makes literature, or both?
I think both, mostly because the processes feel so intertwined to me, but maybe mostly as a reader of literature in general, and probably as a writer of poetry in general, I would say. I've been thinking about something Terrence Hayes said in his Paris Review interview about poetry as a kind of weapon against gaslighting, like both the gaslighting we do to ourselves and the gaslighting that others do to us. Like writing poetry as a way to really listen to yourself and figure out what you're thinking about and what you care about and what's going on in your body and in your heart and in your mind. So that's a value of poetry that I've been thinking about. And also poetry as this arena where parts of you can speak that can't or won't speak anywhere else in your life. And therefore poetry as this tool for stepping into a more full and true version of yourself, which can't help but have effects outside of you in the world, even if it feels mysterious and nebulous and impossible to track. I just can't see how that doesn't have effects in the quote real world, even though it's such an interior and mysterious process.
Well, I mean, what we mean when we say the real world, as though we are not part of the real world. I hate
that phrase.
Right?
I know. And I think my imagined world feels just as real, if not more so than the quote unquote real world. So I try not to use that phrase.
I think there's an interesting thing, for me, a lot of times the way I figure out what I'm feeling has less to do with what I write and more to do with what I photograph. But something that is a really big difference between the two is that photography is really quick, at least the way that I do it, it is. It's very immediate. And even when you're doing something like automatic writing, there still has to be a sort of sustained attention over a longer period of time than just like 1/1000th of a second,
Yeah.
And that is something that I find really interesting in terms of like I think that this is something also that we sort of touched on in the first segment with the poems, like what does that process of paying attention do? What does it do for us as the writer? And then what does it do for the reader? Like the fact that we as the writer have taken that time, and I try not to use the word paid attention or spent time, right? I
know it's so hard to get away from these metaphors built into the English language about money and about violence and all these things.
But the fact that we have spent that time with the language on the page has some effect on the reader as well, right? And that does, to the extent that it has an effect on a person, that it has an effect in the world, right? But it's hard. It's a little hard to get your arms around.
It really is. I know. I realize this topic is also sort of impossible to talk about. And I think that's part of what's drawing me to it at the same time. It's like, why not dive into what's impossible to talk about? But I think also what you said about slowing down and really attending to something and engaging your imagination. I really feel like the imagination is like a muscle. And so exercising this muscle that then we go back out into the world and our imagination is awake, and that has impacts on how we live and interact with other people. And also, we live at this time when we're expected to do so much so fast, and there's so much, impacting our attention and fighting for our attention, and language and public discourse can feel really depressing and flattening and full of these strained buzzwords and unsatisfying categories. And, poetry is a place where you can fall in love with words again and become awake to their ability to get at something that feels weird or personal or meaningful. And I just feel like as a practice at reading it and writing it, I don't know, it feels like the only possible antidote for the sort of existential malady that I have. And I don't know if others feel that way, but it definitely feels crucial to me for all of those reasons.
What's interesting for me is sometimes I think, so, in the break, you paid me a very nice compliment and said that I'm a good reader, and I appreciate that. But sometimes I wonder if maybe I'm not that good of a reader, because a lot of times what you were just describing in terms of falling in love with words, with language over again, I can get so wrapped up with the meaning of words by the sort of aboutness of words, by the sort of referent of language, that I have to really concentrate to pay attention to what the words actually are. Sometimes I used to describe the way that I would read when I was younger, that it was like watching a movie in my head, and that my brain was almost not even paying attention to the words on the page, that I was not even really aware of the words on the page. That it was like an experience was just entering me through my eyeballs.
Sounds amazing.
I mean, there is a nice thing about that especially when you're a kid and, you don't have a TV.
Just being able to disappear into it. I wonder if we'll ever really be able to read like that again.
I can do that with certain kinds of fiction still.
Yeah.
But I guess what I mean is that the engagement with the language itself is something that I kind of have to remind myself to do sometimes,
Yeah. I think poems, there are so many different ways to read them. It almost feels sometimes like reading with different pairs of glasses on. And I've heard people describe this as a revision strategy, but I think it's also can be a fun way just to read and engage with poems. Like, I'm going to read this really attending to the sound of things. And this is going to be when I read it out loud and just relish in the sound. And then maybe I'll read again and just really try to visualize what's happening, really read with my eyes. And maybe I'll read again and try to, see it like a play, like a play on a stage, and really attend to the story and the motions. I don't know. I think there are so many different ways to read a poem. And if you're not getting everything at the same time, that doesn't mean you're a bad reader. It might just be an aspect of poetry that it, invites multiple engagements.
Yeah. I mean, something that I come back to so often when I'm reading poetry. And this is actually, if I recall correctly, we actually talked about this when we were talking about Bridget Begin Kelly's song, that I tend to get so caught up in trying to understand what the poem is saying, what it means, because that's how language, like, to me, foremost, like first, before anything else, language is a tool for conveying meaning. And obviously, that's true for everybody. That's how communication works. But, for example, I mentioned Kazim Ali a few minutes ago, and he has a poem. It's a short poem. It's called No Name. And the first no is K-N-O-W. The second one is N-O, No Name. And that is a poem that is really, really sound driven. Most of the lines and most of the words even have the sound or in them, like mooring at the shore. And ultimately it ends up being a poem, kind of an anti-war poem or anti-militarism poem, something like that. But it really, the sound is so central to it that when you hear it out loud, it kind of almost hits you. This sounds like I'm saying something bad about it, but it's almost like hitting you over the head with the sound. Like, the sound is so repetitive and so forward in it that you can't not pay attention to it, and you can almost get lost in the sound. And I feel like a lot of times when I talk to poets, that what poets often talk about when they talk about poems, whether their own or somebody else's, is that sort of music of poetry. And when I'm able to get there, it does feel a little bit like a rewiring of my brain. And that is something that feels impactful and powerful. But like that is almost never where I go first. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. It's not my natural first way either. And I really learned a lot. There was a steep learning curve for me when I went to poem school, because I had several people in my cohort who are very much sound driven poets. And I am a very narrative and image driven poet. And I really had to learn how to engage with their work. It felt like I had to like grow a new brain or something, like you were describing, because it was so different. And now, I just find it entrancing, and I'm in awe of these poets, particularly when I hear their work out loud, because it's song, it's singing, and yet it's also often painting a kind of picture in my head too. And when it's done really well, those loud and overwhelming sounds don't feel like they're obscuring meaning. They feel like they're what's transmitting the feeling to me, or the movement to me. And I mean, Abby Polikoff is one of them. The poet Erin McCoy is another one who I just feel so lucky to have gotten to write alongside them for all these years now, and to interact with their work. And I love the way they challenge me, but it does challenge me. I can admit that it's not my natural inclination, but I've learned to really, really adore soundy poems, even though I don't know if I'll ever, write that way. I hope to continue to grow and learn from music in regards to writing. But I think, I don't know, I'm always torn between this desire to really study up and pursue very different kinds of aesthetics from my own. And there's this voice in my head that says, it's really wise to move deeper in the directions that you're naturally called in. And if you have any sort of natural gifting, not to discount that, to actually go towards that. So trying to juggle those two things. But
it is an interesting thing how the process of art making, I kind of feel like it almost can't help be revelatory to oneself about like who you are. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're not necessarily making work that has an intended aboutness to it, sort of similar to what you were saying. When I sit down to write a poem or an essay or something, I'm usually sitting down with an idea in mind of what I want it to be about first. Mm-hmm. And even if I'm starting this with a narrative or an image or something like that, it's got an aboutness to start with. And I might get somewhere to a different aboutness that I didn't expect through the process of making it.
Yeah.
But I know some people will, like I remember I was talking with Ross Sutherland, who I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a podcaster and a writer and a poet. And he often uses really like generative tools for writing his poems, where he just starts off with language in a really non-meaningful way, in
almost just pulling a word out of a hat and rolling with it.
He'll use some techniques from like the Oulipo.
Yeah.
Or he'll use, like I remember one time he was describing on his show this process of using like a crossword or like a word search, where like he was taking unrelated letters in a word search and then fitting words, like letters in between them to make words. But it was just some like out of a newspaper somewhere that he didn't make up, And then through the process
gamifying.
Through the process of creating language to fit into this random thing, then he actually ends up getting somewhere that does have an aboutness. Mm-hmm. But to me, I just can't work that way.
Yeah. Some people really love games, don't they? I'm not a game player. Like not really in my art and not in the world. Like I will reluctantly play a game. like a board game or whatever. It's just, I don't know what it is. It doesn't do it for me. But I love that other people love them and find it meaningful and fun. And I am, interested in all those surrealists and the games they would play. And I do know that sometimes you can stumble into something that feels really meaningful and true, sort of stumbling through the side door into something you didn't expect. And I imagine that's really, really exciting. But for me, when I engage with that sort of play in regards to writing poems, I don't know, it can feel like a way to pass the time, but it very rarely to never yields a piece of writing that feels really meaningful to me, or like I risked something valuable in it.
I think, sort of going back to something you said at the beginning, where you were talking about poetry, writing, literature, these things being able to allow a person to communicate or present or articulate or be in a different way from how one is able to speak just in life. I found that a really interesting idea, in particular because, I don't know, I try to avoid psychoanalyzing my guests, but
psychoanalyze me, I'm ready.
No, but what I mean is, I've been listening to you on the Poets Lawn for years now, and I've been enjoying your poems for years now, and I don't know if I would have necessarily guessed that those two people go together if I didn't already know,
Uh-huh.
And it's not to say that when you're on your show talking to somebody or talking to Doogie and Luther, that you're not articulate or that you are not profound, right? Because you are. But it's just that the persona that you present when you're in that space, being that version of yourself, is, for lack of a better word, more fun.
Yeah. Accurate. That feels incredibly accurate.
The poems, for as beautiful and moving and profound and sometimes gut-wrenching as they are, I wouldn't necessarily call them fun, if that makes sense.
Wow, I'm shocked. I'm completely shocked. I do have one kind of fun poem, don't I? Even after all that, no epiphany. That's kind of fun. There's a little humor in there.
I'm not saying that your poems are without humor. No, I'm just saying that
it's also dark.
The timbre, the timbre of the language is a little different.
That's exactly true. And I think that's part of also what makes me feel a little split in half when I do conversations where I also read the poems, because while they both feel so truly me, they feel like such different sides of me. It's hard for me to even reconcile sometimes how I'm the same person, because the side of me that is able to come through in the poems is so different from the me that hangs out with my friends and that interacts with my beloveds on a daily basis. I mean, I'm a pretty, playful and affectionate person, but yeah, I have this darker, cagier side that also needs to live.
I mean, when we talk about the uses of literature and poetry, I mean, I think that is something that obviously a lot of people want to talk about and put into sort of capitalist terms. And I don't think that's what we're doing here. But I think that whether you are a writer or just a reader, I shouldn't say just a reader, that it's giving you the opportunity to engage with experiences and feelings that are not necessarily what you would ordinarily be engaging with. And I think that there is a really deep value to that. Another thing is, there's a sort of facile way of talking about this in terms of that literature produces empathy. And I don't know that there's actually a lot of evidence for that, because
I agree. I feel like there was a time when everyone just sort of tossed that out there like it was this proven truth of like this inherent value of literature was that it made us all more empathetic and therefore would make us interact with more kindness with other people out in the world. And I agree. I don't really see that happening. I wonder if there's more of a general understanding that that's not the case now.
Well, I'm not sure there's a general understanding, but I do think that more people are sort of pushing back on that idea. But whether or not poetry or literature can make us more empathetic. I mean, I guess I think people have been talking about this for sort of thousands of years, right? Like even going back to the Aristotle sort of definition of tragedy as being something that you are creating in order to produce a state of catharsis in the audience, right? That it's having some kind of effect of, you're seeing these, I mean, he's talking about theater, right? But it works in the same way, right? That you're engaging with this narrative or with this lyric, and by producing in you, eliciting some kind of emotional response, that it has some sort of purgative effect. And again, like, I don't know if that purgative effect is necessarily correct either, but that it's putting you, the reader, in a space that's outside of your everyday, and whatever it's doing something.
Yeah, I that feels true to me. Yeah, that feels truer to me than the empathy aspect, because it doesn't have like a value assigned to it necessarily. Like that could be good or bad, it just is. It's just an aspect. Similar to the empathy literature argument, there was also, people used to always say, like, if poetry has no value, then why does everyone want it at their funeral or their wedding ceremony? Which, like, I get that, and I do think that is, a value of poetry. But like, it seems really rare to me that like a contemporary poem is ever read at a funeral. Like, it does happen, but it seems like the touchstone ones are kind of the same 3 really old poems. So as a justification for like writing poetry right now, I don't know how convincing that is as an argument, but I don't know. I could be wrong.
I mean, I guess the only times I can think of contemporary art being a part of somebody's wedding, let alone funeral, is when the people who are getting married are artists themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. And I have heard some beautiful occasional poetry written for writers who are getting married by their amazing writer friends. Like, I have experienced that, and it's amazing. But yeah, just non-writers at weddings, you're probably not going to hear much contemporary poetry.
I think that, I mean, this is a little bit getting towards like, what are the average readers engaging with in the first place? I mean, there's a statistic that I think is fairly bogus, that, most people after high school don't really read.
Yeah.
Or, that I remember seeing this thing once that said that like the average person after high school only reads like 12 books for the whole rest of their life, which I think is made up.
I know. It's like, we can't process that. Those of us who love to read, it's outside of comprehension.
But I would say that it's probably true that most people are probably not necessarily rushing out to get stuff that's sort of cutting edge and innovative and contemporary in terms of the art that they consume, whether that might be film or television or books or whatever. And yet, well, one, I don't know that necessarily means that the depth of someone's engagement with a particular work of art is any less for it, having been limited to like 1 or 2 classic poems or whatever. But also, I mean, for one thing, you never really know what's going to end up being the classic in 100 years. Not that necessarily matters to me now. Like, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it really matters to me if anything that I've ever published will be like famous way after I'm dead. Like, should that matter to me? I don't know. But
there's no way to know if it's going to happen or not. So
yeah. But also, like, I go back and forth on things like this, but I also think, to me, the thing that really is amazing about contemporary art in any form is that there's something kind of special in knowing that the person who did this thing is still around and I could theoretically talk to them, Yes.
I love that aspect. And when you're also engaged with making things, it feels like this giant conversation that's happening, and we're talking to each other and past each other and taking certain ideas in unexpected directions. And I find that really exciting and meaningful. I'm a very introverted person, and I really love people most of the time. And want to be in conversation with them in various ways. And yeah, there is something so thrilling about someone being alive at the second and creating something that connects with me.
Yeah. So the last question that I always end with is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yes, there have been lots of things, but what comes quickest to mind is the book When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut, which is translated from Spanish by Adrian Nathan West. And it's a novel. I don't know if you've read it. It's
I have not.
Technically historical fiction, but it reads unlike anything I've ever read. It moves in such a gripping, disturbing, wildly imaginative way. And it's a short book, so it feels just explosive to read. And it's about these topics that normally wouldn't be my topics that I'm drawn to. So it's following these various figures in mathematics and science and dealing with things like quantum mechanics, which I know fuck all about. And it's just fascinating. I can't stop thinking about it. I wasn't expecting to be so absorbed and disturbed by this book, which is really diving into how, like, these places where scientific pursuit and mathematical pursuit and madness and violence start swirling all together. And the book starts out and it's almost entirely non-fictional in that it's research-based, but it reads in this kind of gripping fictional way. And then gradually, as you read the book, it becomes more and more fictionalized, which I didn't know until the very end. And I sort of read this blurb about it because the whole thing just feels imaginative and wild and engaged with the lives of these real people who really lived and made these big discoveries and invented these often horrifying things with science. But yeah, I guess that's my artifact that is meaning something to me. I just really was captivated by it and terrified by it. And it felt like it was enacting in my head this kind of madness that the characters were experiencing. And I stayed up really late reading it, and I recommend it. If that sort of experience sounds like something that anyone would want to have, then I recommend it. I can totally see how it would not appeal to everyone.
When a book can grab a hold of you and make you stay up late, that to me, that's like the best thing. You lose track of time and.
Right. And this comes in a time when I've been starting a lot of books and not finishing them. It had been a while since I was just totally absorbed by something. And I really loved it.
Well, great. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much, Mike. This was fantastic.
All right. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, there are links in the show notes for you to purchase copies of Judas Goat. There is also a link to Gabby's website where you can find a full, ever-updating list of Gabby's upcoming book events. Do check those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed the show, you could tell a friend. You could tell the podcast listening world by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. Or you could tell me by sending me an email or catching me on social media. You can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechannelopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back in February with a new conversation, so do be sure to come back for that. Until then, remember, keep the channel open.